The dust of the high plains settled on everything, a fine, pale powder that coated the hem of her dark dress and found its way into the lines on her hands. The woman stood beside the single stagecoach that served the frontier town, a lone, still figure against the vast, indifferent sky. She carried a small valise and a heavy quietness that seemed to weigh more than any luggage. She had arrived in this place not by choice, but because it was the last stop on a line she could afford, the final period at the end of a sentence written by another's hand. Her state was one of profound solitude. She was recently bereaved, stripped of a future she had barely begun to imagine, and her purse contained only a few coins that felt thin and useless under her thumb. Her dignity was a garment she wore like a second skin, carefully mended and worn with a straightness of spine that defied her circumstances. Inside, however, a cold dread coiled in her stomach. She was a stranger here, an outsider with a face that marked her as different from the sun-weathered townsfolk who cast curious and not entirely friendly glances her way. The town itself was a collection of raw timber buildings, huddled together against the wind, a place that felt temporary, as if it could be scoured away by the next hard season. Its name was of no consequence to her. It was simply the edge of her world. For 2 days she survived on the last of the biscuits she had packed, and the water from the town pump, sleeping in a livery stable where the scent of hay and horses was a small creaturely comfort. But hunger was a patient predator. It gnawed at her resolve, forcing her from the relative anonymity of the stable into the public glare of the general store. The air inside was thick with the smells of coffee, cured meat, and coal oil. A bell above the door announced her entry with a jangling sound that felt like an accusation. The storekeeper, a man with a soft middle and hard eyes, watched her as she moved through the narrow aisles. She picked up a small sack of flour, then a tin of lard, her hands moving with a slow deliberation that belied the frantic calculation happening in her mind. She knew before she reached the counter that the coins in her pocket would not be enough. She placed the items on the worn wood, her gaze steady. The storekeeper tallied the cost, his lips a thin, unimpressed line. As she had known, the total was more than she possessed. A flush of heat crept up her neck, but her expression remained serene. She began to put the lard back, her apology a quiet murmur, but the man's hand shot out and covered hers, his grip surprisingly strong. Behind her, a few of the town's women who had been whispering over a bolt of calico fell silent. The entire store seemed to hold its breath. It was the town's banker, a man whose respectability was as carefully constructed as the false front on his establishment, who stepped forward. He had been lurking near the back, observing all. "Is there a problem here?" the banker asked, his voice smooth and coated with a false layer of concern. The storekeeper, taking his cue, tightened his grip on the woman's wrist. "She can't pay. Tried to take what she couldn't afford." The accusation hung in the air, ugly and immediate. It was not precisely true, but in a town like this the nuance was irrelevant. She was an outsider, she was poor, and she was accused. That was enough. The woman did not struggle, she simply stood, her wrist trapped, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the banker's shoulder, her composure an island in a hostile sea. The town had shown its face, and it was one of cold, summary judgment. Her isolation was now complete, a wall built of suspicion and circumstance. From the cool shadows of the feed and grain section, another man had watched the scene unfold. He was the rancher, a figure as much a part of the local landscape as the granite outcrops that broke the monotony of the plains. For a decade, since the fever had taken his wife, his ranch had been a fortress of solitude, a place where the silence was broken only by the wind and the lowing of cattle. No woman had set foot on his land in all that time, and he had built high fences around his life, both literal and figurative. He was a man of few words, respected for his honesty and the quality of his stock, but kept at a distance by a grief that had settled into the very marrow of his bones. He observed the woman, noting the unbowed line of her back, and the way her hands, though empty, did not tremble. He saw not a thief, but a person cornered by desperation, and it stirred something in him, a dormant sense of justice that had long been buried under the quiet weight of his own sorrow. He knew the banker, knew the predatory nature that lurked beneath the man's polished veneer. The rancher had seen him prey on ranchers hit by drought and families struck by illness, always with a sympathetic smile and a tightly worded legal document that served as a noose. He stepped forward, his boots making a solid, deliberate sound on the floorboards. The simple act of his movement shifted the gravity in the room. Heads turned. The whispering stopped. The rancher's presence was a quiet authority the banker's money could not buy. He did not look at the banker or the storekeeper. His gaze went directly to the woman. "I will cover it," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. He dropped a heavy coin on the counter, the silver ringing with a finality that brooked no argument. The storekeeper released the woman's wrist as if it had suddenly grown hot. The rancher then looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her dark eyes, the weariness and the flicker of defiant pride that had not been extinguished. He did not offer charity, his pride was as fierce as hers. He made a practical, transactional offer. His words laid out plain and simple, for the entire store to hear. "My ledgers are a mess. The man I had doing them was more creative than he was accurate. I need a bookkeeper." He paused, letting the offer settle in the charged silence. "I offer room and board and a fair wage. The work is honest." It was not a plea nor a command. It was a statement of fact, a lifeline offered not out of pity but as a mutually beneficial arrangement. He was giving her a chance to preserve her dignity, and in the process he was cracking open the door to his own long barricaded world. The town watched, stunned into silence by the solitary rancher's public intervention. The woman looked from the coin on the counter to the rancher's face. It was a hard, weathered face, etched with lines of sun and sorrow, but his eyes were clear and direct. She saw no pity there, only a straightforward assessment of a situation. He was offering her a trade, her skill for his protection. It was a language she understood far better than the veiled hostility she had encountered thus far. She gave a single sharp nod. "I accept," she said, her voice quiet but firm, a small solid thing in the echoing silence of the store. The arrangement was made. The journey to his ranch was a silent one, the wagon creaking a rhythmic complaint against the vast, quiet landscape. The rancher handled the reins with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, his attention fixed on the horizon. She sat on the wagon bench beside him, her small valise at her feet, her hands folded in her lap. The silence between them was not awkward, it was functional, like a well-made tool. It was a space for observation. She noted the way the grasslands rolled away like a great tawny ocean, the sheer scale of it, a thing that could either swallow a person whole or grant them a kind of freedom. The ranch house was much like the man himself, solid, unadorned, and built to withstand the elements. It was a structure of stone and thick timber, set low against a rise to blunt the force of the winter winds. Inside it was clean but stark. The air was stale with solitude. Dust motes danced in the shafts of late afternoon light, illuminating a space that was functional but devoid of any softness. It was a place a man lived in, but it was not a home. There was a layer of dust on the mantelpiece, a stack of unread newspapers on a side table, and a profound sense of stillness, as if the life within it had been held in suspension for a very long time. He showed her to a small plain room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the endless prairie. "This will be yours," he stated, then gestured toward the main room. "The ledgers are on the desk." And with that he left her, retreating to the barn and the familiar undemanding company of his livestock. He did not know how to fill the spaces in his house with conversation, so he left them empty. She did not unpack her valise immediately. Instead, she went to the desk. It was a large roll-top affair cluttered with receipts, bills of lading, and hastily scrawled notes. And there were the ledgers. She opened the first one. As he had said, they were a mess. The columns were uneven, the ink was blotted, and the numbers seemed to follow a logic known only to the man who had written them. A faint ironic smile touched her lips. Here at least was a problem she knew how to solve. Order could be made from this chaos. Over the next week she brought a quiet revolution to the ranch house. She began with the ledgers, working with a focused intensity that impressed the rancher. He would come in from the fields smelling of sun and sweat and earth, and find her bent over the desk, a slim, dark-haired figure bathed in the golden light of the lamp. She did not speak much, but the scratching of her pen was a new and not unpleasant sound in the quiet house. She untangled the snarled threads of his finances, creating new pages with columns of perfect, meticulous script. She found errors, questioned invoices, and uncovered discrepancies that hinted at something more than mere incompetence on the part of the previous bookkeeper. Beyond the desk, her influence spread in subtle ways. The stale air in the house was replaced by the clean scent of soap and fresh air from opened windows. One afternoon he came in to find a bowl of wildflowers on the table, a splash of vibrant, defiant color against the drab wood. He stopped in the doorway, staring at them. It had been 10 years since there had been flowers in his house. He felt a strange tightening in his chest, a feeling he could not name, and he turned and walked back out without a word. She was a ghost of competence in his home. She mended his work shirts, sewing the seams with tiny even stitches that were stronger than the original. She found a neglected vegetable patch behind the house choked with weeds and began to reclaim it, her hands working the soil with a patient skill. She cooked simple meals that were nourishing and flavorful, leaving his portion on the stove to keep warm. They rarely ate together in those first weeks. Their lives ran in parallel, occupying the same space but seldom intersecting directly. Yet a current of respect began to flow between them, silent and deep. He observed her tireless industry, her intelligence, and the quiet dignity that never wavered. He found himself listening for the soft sound of her footsteps in the house. One evening, she approached him not with a question about the household, but about the ranch itself. She had found a bill for feed that was priced nearly double the usual rate, from a supplier connected to the town banker. "This is an error," she said, her voice calm and certain, pointing to the line in the ledger. "Or it is theft." He looked at the entry, then at her. He had overlooked it, too consumed by the larger rhythms of the ranch to notice the small leaks in his finances. He saw that her mind was as sharp as any tool he owned. "You're right," he said, the admission a mark of his growing trust. He began to talk to her about the ranch, about the price of cattle, the threat of drought, the complex calculus of survival in this harsh land. And he found that she listened, truly listened, her questions precise and insightful. She was not just keeping his books, she was beginning to understand his life. The formal arrangement was slowly, imperceptibly transforming into a partnership, a quiet alliance against the world. The town banker did not like alliances he could not control. He had orchestrated the woman's public humiliation with the casual cruelty of a man swatting a fly, intending to reinforce his own standing as the arbiter of the town's affairs. The rancher's intervention had been an unexpected and unwelcome complication. The banker had counted on the rancher's isolation, assuming the man was too lost in his own grief to interfere. The fact that the woman was now installed at the ranch, bringing order to the one part of the rancher's life the banker had hoped to exploit, was an intolerable affront. His motivations were a bitter cocktail of greed and humiliated pride. He had been quietly overcharging the rancher for months, through his network of business interests, a slow siphoning of profits he considered his due. He knew the rancher was wealthy in land and stock, but often short on cash, a vulnerability he had been patiently waiting to leverage. The woman, with her sharp eyes and meticulous ledgers, was a direct threat to this enterprise. But it was more than just money. The rancher's public defiance had been a challenge to his authority, and the woman's presence at the ranch was a constant, visible reminder of that challenge. He began his campaign subtly, using the weapon he wielded best, gossip. His wife, a woman whose piety was matched only by her malice, began to speak in hushed, concerned tones about the unseemly arrangement at the ranch. The talk spread through the town like a grass fire, whispered over sewing circles and store counters. The narrative was simple and poisonous. A solitary man, a vulnerable foreign woman, living together under one roof without the sanction of marriage. It was a story designed to isolate them further, to turn the town's simmering suspicion into outright hostility. The rancher felt the shift immediately. When he went to town for supplies, conversations would cease as he entered a room. Men who had once greeted him with a nod now looked away, their faces closed and judgmental. He ignored it, his expression as impassive as stone, but inside a cold anger burned. He was a man who valued his privacy above all else, and he resented the town's greasy fingerprints on his life. He resented it even more on her behalf. He saw the way the storekeeper's wife now refused to meet her eyes, the way children were sometimes pulled away as she passed. When social pressure failed to dislodge her, the banker escalated his tactics. He sent a letter to the ranch, a crisp white envelope that felt cold to the touch. It was a formal notice, citing a clause in a loan document the rancher had signed years ago during a bad winter. The banker was calling in a portion of the note, a significant sum that he knew the rancher would not have in ready cash. The deadline was short, impossibly so. It was a blatant attempt to create a financial crisis, to force the rancher to sell off stock at a loss, or better yet, sell a parcel of his land. Specifically the parcel with the best water rights in the valley, which the banker had long coveted. The rancher read the letter twice, his jaw tightening until the muscle jumped. He placed the legal document on the desk where she was working. She read it, her expression unchanging, but he saw the way her hands stilled over the open ledger. The threat was no longer a matter of whispers. It was a clear and present danger to the very ground beneath their feet. "He wants the north pasture," the rancher said, his voice flat, "the one with the spring." She looked up from the letter, her gaze meeting his. "There is another way," she said, her voice low but steady. She turned a page in the ledger she had been reconstructing. Her finger traced a series of payments made to the former bookkeeper, payments that were disguised as ranch expenses, but which she had traced back to an account controlled by the banker. It was not just overcharging, it was outright fraud. "He has been stealing from you for years," she stated. "This is the proof." The evidence was there, in the neat columns of her own hand, a weapon forged from ink and paper. The banker had meant to use the law to break them, but she had found the truth that could break him instead. The threat had escalated, but in doing so, it had brought the two of them closer, united against a common enemy. The banker, realizing his financial threats were being met with a maddening silence from the ranch, grew desperate. His greed and wounded pride curdled into something more volatile. He knew that the evidence of his fraud, if it existed, was on that ranch, likely locked within the woman's meticulous ledgers. He could not allow that proof to reach the circuit judge, who was due in a month. He needed to destroy it, and to punish the man and woman who had dared to defy him. The night was moonless, the kind of deep, star-pricked dark that swallows sound. A hot, dry wind had been blowing for days, rattling the windows of the ranch house and turning the prairie grass to tinder. The rancher was restless, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. He trusted the woman's accounting, but he did not trust the banker to play by any rules but his own. He was checking the latches on the barn doors when he first smelled it. Not the familiar scent of hay and animals, but the sharp, acrid odor of smoke where it should not be. He spun around, his eyes scanning the darkness. A flicker of orange caught his eye, a malevolent bloom of light against the far wall of the main barn near the hayloft. It was not an accident. The wind was blowing from the north, perfectly positioned to drive the flames through the structure and toward the house. In that instant, the rancher's world narrowed to a single terrible focus. The horses trapped in their stalls, the winter feed that represented a year's work, and the woman asleep in the house. He burst through the door of the ranch house, shouting her name. She met him in the main room, already awake, her face pale in the flickering, hellish light that now filled the windows. There was no time for explanations. "Fire! Get the ledgers!" he commanded, his voice raw. "Take them to the root cellar. Stay there." He did not wait for an answer, turning and running back toward the inferno. She did exactly as he said, her movements swift and precise. She gathered the ledgers, the proof of their defense, and secured them in the cool, subterranean safety of the cellar. But she did not stay there. As she emerged, the roar of the fire was a living thing, and she saw the rancher silhouetted against the flames, fighting a losing battle to get the terrified horses out of the burning barn. One of the heavy stall doors was jammed, its wood swelling in the intense heat. Without a second thought, she ran not away from the danger, but toward it. She grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the workshop, the cold metal, a stark contrast to the searing heat that washed over her skin. The rancher was heaving against the door, his face grim with smoke and effort, when she appeared at his side. He yelled at her to go back, but she ignored him, wedging the tip of the pry bar into the seam of the door. "Together!" she shouted over the roar of the fire. He looked at her for a split second, saw the absolute determination in her eyes, and nodded. They put their combined weight into it, the wood groaning in protest before splintering and giving way. The last of the panicked horses thundered out into the night. Just as they stumbled back, a flaming timber crashed down from the loft, landing precisely where they had been standing seconds before. It threw a shower of sparks, one of which caught on the sleeve of the rancher's shirt. He didn't even notice, his attention fixed on the collapsing roof of the barn, but she did. She moved instantly, beating out the small flame with her bare hands, her palms stinging from the heat. He flinched, looking down at his arm and then at her, his eyes wide with a dawning realization in the chaotic, dancing light. She had not only worked beside him, she had just saved him from serious injury or worse. They retreated to a safe distance, watching as the barn, the product of years of labor, was consumed by the fire. The structure groaned its last and collapsed inward, sending a great geyser of sparks into the dark sky. The immediate danger was over. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, there was only the crackling of the dying fire and the sound of their own harsh breathing. They stood side by side, covered in soot, their faces streaked, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. He turned to her then, his expression stripped of its usual reserve. He reached out and took her hands, turning them over to inspect the reddened palms. His touch was unexpectedly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. It was the first time he had touched her with anything other than accidental work-related contact. It was an act of pure, unadorned concern. "You should have stayed in the cellar," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The ledgers would be worthless if the ranch was gone," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. "And a ranch is nothing without its rancher." In that moment, under a sky choked with smoke and lit by the embers of his past, the high fences he had built around his heart for a decade finally crumbled to dust. He thought of the wife he had lost, a grief he had carried like a stone. And for the first time, it felt not like a betrayal to feel something else, but like a continuation of life. He looked at this resilient woman, who had faced down poverty, scorn, and now fire, all with a quiet, unbreakable strength. "My wife," he began, the words rusty and difficult, "she planted those wildflowers you found. I hadn't been able to look at them, not really, not until you put them on the table." It was a confession of a grief so deep it had colored his entire world gray. It was the most vulnerable he had allowed himself to be with anyone in 10 years. She simply listened, her soot-stained hands still held in his, offering him the silent, profound comfort of her presence. Their partnership had been forged in ink and numbers, but it had just been tempered in fire. The dawn broke grey and grim, revealing the smouldering skeleton of the barn. The air hung thick with the smell of wet ash and loss. But as the sun rose higher, it illuminated not a scene of defeat, but one of resolve. The rancher and the woman stood together, surveying the damage, their faces set. The fire had been meant to destroy them, but it had only succeeded in burning away any remaining distance between them. The ledgers were safe, and so were they. They rode into town later that morning, not on the wagon, but on horseback, sitting tall and straight. They were covered in soot, their clothes singed, but they moved with a shared purpose that was impossible to miss. They did not go to the sheriff. The town's lawman was a creature of the banker, a man who saw what he was paid to see. Instead, they rode directly to the center of town, stopping in front of the general store, where the usual morning gathering of townsfolk was underway. The banker was there, holding court on the boardwalk, a cup of coffee in his hand. He was pontificating about the need for civic order, his voice oozing with self-importance. When he saw the two of them, a flicker of something, surprise, then alarm, crossed his features before being masked by his usual placid smile. "My dear friends," he said, stepping forward, "I heard there was a terrible accident at your ranch last night, a tragedy. If there is anything the bank can do to help—" The rancher swung down from his horse. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a single threat. He simply walked up to the banker, the woman dismounting and following a step behind him, one of the incriminating ledgers held firmly under her arm. "There was no accident," the rancher said, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. Every person on the street had stopped to watch. The woman stepped forward and opened the ledger. She did not speak to the banker, but to the assembled townspeople, the farmers, the blacksmith, the other ranchers who had all, at one time or another, found themselves in the banker's debt. "For 2 years," she began, her voice clear and steady, "your banker has been systematically defrauding this man." She pointed to a line item, then another. "He created false invoices. He skimmed profits from cattle sales. He paid a ghost employee, the ranch's former bookkeeper, with the ranch's money, and that money went directly back to him." She laid out the evidence with cold, irrefutable precision. It was not an emotional appeal, it was a clinical dissection of his greed. A murmur went through the crowd. Men who had long harbored their own suspicions about the banker's dealings began to exchange dark looks. The banker's face, which had been a mask of polite concern, began to pale. He sputtered denials, calling her a liar, an outsider with a grudge. "And last night," the rancher continued, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level, "when he knew we had this proof, he tried to burn it. He tried to burn it all." He held up his arm, showing the singed fabric of his sleeve. The charge hung in the air, more damning than any financial crime. Arson. Attempted murder. The banker's composure finally shattered. He began to back away, his eyes darting around, looking for an ally, but he found none. The faces of the townspeople, faces he had controlled for years with credit and intimidation, were now hard with contempt. His power, built on a foundation of lies, had crumbled in the space of a few minutes. His social ruin was absolute. They left him there, surrounded by the cold silence of his former neighbors, and rode away. They did not look back. The ride home was as quiet as the first one they had taken together, but the nature of the silence had changed completely. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the deep, comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without the need for words. The sun was warm on their backs, and the prairie, which had once seemed so vast and empty, now felt like a kingdom they had successfully defended. They stopped on the rise overlooking the ranch house. Below them lay the blackened footprint of the barn, a scar on the land. But the house stood strong, the horses grazed peacefully in a far pasture, and the smoke had finally cleared from the air. It was a place of ruin, but also a place of beginning. The rancher turned to her, his face serious. He did not have the words for poetry or romance. His feelings were practical things like fence posts and harnesses. They were built to last. "This arrangement we have," he said, his voice quiet, "it is no longer accurate. I am not in need of a bookkeeper." He paused, and for a terrifying moment she thought he was sending her away. Then he continued, "I am in need of a partner, in all of it." He gestured to the land, the house, the wide sky. "I am asking you to stay, not as my housekeeper, but as my wife." The proposal was as plain-spoken and solid as the man himself, an offer not of hearts and flowers, but of a shared life, a shared future built on the bedrock of respect they had earned. A year passed, marked by the turning of the seasons. The spring rains washed the last of the ash from the soil, and new grass grew green and hopeful. Summer came, hot and long, and with it the sounds of hammers and saws. A new barn rose from the footprint of the old one, larger and better built, a testament to a future they were constructing together. The rancher and his wife worked side by side, planning its layout, choosing the timbers, their hands often brushing, as they passed tools to one another. The ranch, once a place of stark solitude, now teemed with a quiet, purposeful life. The vegetable garden she had reclaimed from the weeds flourished under her care, producing a bounty that filled their larder. He taught her about the cattle, and she, in turn, taught him how to see the patterns in the market, her sharp mind for numbers, proving as valuable as his knowledge of the land. Their shared work was a constant unspoken conversation. The ledgers were still kept with meticulous care, but now they were a record of shared prosperity, not a defense against external threats. The town's opinion, as fickle as the prairie wind, had shifted completely. The banker had left in disgrace, his assets sold off to cover his debts. The story of the fire and the confrontation on Main Street had become local legend. The rancher was no longer seen as just a solitary, grief-stricken man, but as a protector, and his wife, the quiet outsider, was now regarded with a deep and grudging respect. They called her the woman who tamed the rancher's books and faced down the banker without flinching. When they came to town, the storekeeper greeted them with a deference that bordered on fear, and his wife offered her the first pick of the new calico. They were no longer outsiders, they were pillars of a new, more honest community. Their prosperity was not loud or ostentatious, it was in the health of their cattle, the strength of the new barn, the peace that had settled over the land. It was in the small foal that now ran alongside its mother in the north pasture, the one with the spring that the banker had so coveted. The ranch was thriving, a living symbol of their partnership. One evening in the late fall, as the sun bled gold and crimson across the horizon, they sat together on the porch of the house. It was a ritual they had developed, a time to sit in the quiet of the coming twilight and simply be. He was cleaning a piece of tack, the scent of leather and oil mingling with the cool evening air. She was mending a shirt, her needle moving in small, rhythmic flashes. For a long while neither of them spoke. Then she looked out toward the dark silhouette of the new barn against the vibrant sky. "Do you ever think about that first day?" she asked, her voice soft. "In the store?" He stopped his work, his calloused hands resting on the leather. He looked at her, at the way the fading light caught the silver in the thread she was using. He thought of the desperate, proud woman who had stood her ground against a town's scorn. He thought of the dusty, silent house he had brought her to, and how it was now improbably a home. "I think about it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I think it was the best business decision I ever made." A rare, small smile touched his lips, and she returned it. There was no need for grand declarations. Everything that needed to be said was there in the shared silence, in the comfortable space between them, in the solid presence of the life they had built from the ashes of their separate pasts. They sat together, watching the last of the light fade, content in the lasting peace they had earned.